Hi, I'm Jacqui Beck. I'm a contemporary mixed media painter, art instructor, and creativity coach. These techniques allow for a playfulness and an enjoyment of the painting process. They can be used to add depth and interest to the painting surface. They can be used to alter and change a painting as you go along and to kind of clean things up at the very end. I alter wet paint that I've just applied in a variety of ways. You can use anything. You can use your brush, but you can also use like a palette knife, use a credit card to smear paint. You can roll it on with a roller. There are even some great kitchen tools that cost $2 and are wonderful. So kitchen stores, hardware stores are great places to get tools for making art. One more way to apply paint is to use collaged paper. So you actually glue paper that has paint on it, and that's a wonderful way to apply another layer of paint. One of the things I do a lot is to use a heavy layer of titanium white. The brand I like is made by Utrecht. It dries in a way that I love, and it goes on fairly thickly. I pay attention to how the paint dries and then what it's like to draw into it, scratch into it during that drying process. When it's first applied, especially if it's thick paint, you won't get as good a line by scratching into it as you will a little later in the drying process. With the Utrecht white and many other acrylic paints, there's this point when it becomes almost waxy, and carving into it at that point can be really fun, and you get a really kind of a clean line, and then just a little bit after that you may get a bit of a crackle through it, which can be interesting as well. My preference is to work on panel these days because I find I can carve into things more easily when I'm painting on a piece of wood. The other thing I use a lot are colored pencils or lead pencils. The nice thing with those, of course, is that they leave a little color behind, and that can be really wonderful as well. One other thing you can do to alter the surface of wet paint is to apply the paint and then set something in it that has a texture. For example, even a Starbucks coffee thing that protects your hand from the heat has a lovely corrugated cardboard thing if you open it up, and laying that on gives you an interesting ridged kind of design. Anything that's got texture in it, that's a fun thing to try. The nice thing with acrylics is you can always cover it up. So if you write something silly or weird or too personal and you decide you don't want to share it, then paint over it. But it's just such a nice way of loosening up and kind of owning the painting itself. Now I'm going to talk about and show you some techniques for altering dry paint. Think about there's a painting that you haven't been that happy with. It's been sitting on your shelf for a while and you think, I'm going to just mess around with this. So even once it's finished, you can still go back in and alter the paint. One thing I use to alter dry paint is a paint scraper. This is something that you buy at a hardware store. It's got a blade on it that can be sharpened It's got two sides, so what I do is I wear out one side and then turn it around. You unscrew it and turn it around, and then you've got another sharp side, and eventually you'll need to file it to resharpen the blade. You can scrape dry paint off. You can scrape a layer of collage off. I use some of these techniques as editing tools, as well as just using them to create an interesting surface. You can write, draw, and scratch into dry paint as well. It's a very different process from doing the same things into wet paint. Writing onto dry paint just sits on the surface, though sometimes you'll carve in a little bit. Golden acrylics and probably others make some interesting products that allow you to apply materials or gels that have a bit of a gritty surface that gives what you call tooth to the surface of your existing paint. That will help to pick up the pencil line better. A couple that you might want to try: fine pumice gel and golden pastel ground. If you want to be able to write onto the surface, you might want to try those products. So one thing to realize though, because you're using tools that are water soluble, you have to seal it. And what I do is I just put a thin layer of matte medium over any lines that I make with graphite and with colored pencils and with Caran d'Ache. You need to be careful with acrylic paint because if you use wax or oil, the next layer of acrylic paint can peel off. It will act as a resist. The colored pencils that I use are ones that don't have any wax. Pencils that say watercolor on them generally don't have wax in them. A brand I like is Derwent, and I like Derwent Inktense because they have very saturated color. I also use Caran d'Ache watercolor pastels. They do have a little wax in them, so I don't use them thickly, but sometimes it's nice to have a thicker line of color. I also use graphite pencils. I really like Blackwing, just the line it makes. It's kind of a soft pencil, and I really like that, but there are so many kinds of graphite. Have a good time in the art store choosing some pencils and tools that suit you. And I often, when I go to the art store, I'll pick one new thing to just give a try. Another thing you can do is you can apply a layer of gloss medium, let that dry completely, and then scratch through the gloss medium right into the paint. This works best with a layer that's fairly light colored. After you've scratched through, then you can rub in something transparent. Quinacridone gold is good, or just a little bit of black. And again, you don't want a lot. You may want to dilute the paint a little bit with, say, a glazing medium or something like that. Or just rub some paint in, and this will go down into those lines in a kind of interesting way, and then you can buff the surface when you're finished. A good thing to buff with is, say, a 400 steel wool. One of the things that is really important to me is once I've done some kind of altering of a surface, I make sure that I integrate that into the rest of the painting so that it's not just, here's a painting with some lines in it, but those lines have become part of the painting. So I may paint a little bit over some of the lines. If I collage something, I'll integrate that collage, that piece of collage in, so that it's not just this sort of square piece of something different that stands out. It needs to enhance the painting rather than be something that catches the eye too much in and of itself. Another way to alter dry paint is to sand it off. You need to be careful with sanding because you don't want to breathe acrylic dust. So always use a mask when you're sanding acrylic paint. I find myself using sanding quite often these days. Sometimes there'll be a part of my painting that I've painted over and I think, oh man, I really love what was under that. And so I see if I can sand back to the layer before. I also use sanding to soften edges. If I have a sharp edge and I want to knock that back, I'll just sand the edge a little bit. The other thing is that if I have a texture underneath a layer of paint and I start sanding, I'll hit the high points with the sandpaper, and so it starts making an interesting pattern. There are various grades of sandpaper. I use mostly 100 and 120 grit. Sometimes I'll use a rougher grit of sandpaper if I really want to, scrape back a lot, and then I'll finish it by using a lighter gauge sandpaper. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you learned some things that'll be fun and helpful. Have a look at my website if you're interested. There are also tons of other videos that you can look at. And at some point I'm going to start teaching classes again, which will be great. There's a link to a tool and supply list in the description of this video.